Welcome to the Art of Adventure. This is episode 252 with Andres Roberts. The Art of Adventure is the podcast that helps you travel the world, run your business, and embark on an epic quest. I'm your host, lead explorer, and guide, Derek Loudermilk. You can find the show notes for this episode over on derekloudermilk.com. My guest today is Andres Roberts. He's the founder of BioLeadership, Nature Quest, and Way of Nature. And this guy, I see him as sort of as a big inspiration. And the way that he thinks about taking lessons from nature and applying them to ourselves and applying them to businesses and organizations and systems is very clear and very pure. And you know, as a former biologist and someone that spent a lot of my youth camping and backpacking and spending time outside, I really love that he has thought deeply about bringing these lessons from nature and from, you know, just going and sitting on top of a mountain or going for a walk in the woods, how they can be so powerful for solving some of the biggest problems that we face today, like health crisis, depression, anxiety, disengagement at work, lack of fulfillment, planetary crises like pollution and global warming and refugees and all of these things. There's so much for us to learn about ourselves from nature, and why have we become disengaged from nature. And he talks about this idea of re-enchantment, which it just I really love it. So Andres does a lot of deep thinking about this stuff. He takes leaders and executives and entrepreneurs and influential people out into the wilderness to experience this so he can teach it to them. He previously, this is kind of an interesting part of our conversation, used to teach playfulness and gamification, which, interesting enough, was part of my last book, Superconductors. So Andres and I just have a ton of alignment, and I really respect what he's doing. And I think you're really going to love this episode and his approach to not just learning from nature, but really experiencing the lessons for ourselves. And then what do we do with it? How do we actually make change from what we've learned? So without further ado, here is Andres Roberts. Andres, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Derek. Nice to be here with you.
And I saw you on Instagram or Twitter or something, and immediately I felt I need to look you up, and I did, and then I thought I need to have you on the show. So, wow, the internet bringing us together, amazing. And let's start with maybe you could just define some of the things that you work on. So, you're the creator of BioLeadership. What is that idea exactly?
Sure. Well, BioLeadership starts with a premise that whatever we call leadership today in the world, whether it's leadership of organizations or businesses or communities or governments, it's no longer fit for purpose. It's deliberately provocative, but in fact, if I go further, it may well be the root cause of a lot of the problems that we're trying to fix, whether it's creativity or ecological restoration or inequality across the world. Our contemporary definition of leadership is part of the problem. So BioLeadership begins to say, what if we could redefine leadership in its broadest sense possible? What if we could redefine human development and learning and innovation from a place of reconnection with nature, and dare I say it, even as part of nature? So it's hacking into what we call leadership today and coming up with a whole new version of it as part of the systems that we are part of.
And one thing that I talk about a lot is that we are large mammals, essentially. You know, we're our own biological organisms. It's not that nature is something else. We're part of nature as well. And, we have our own ecosystems, the microbes in our gut and all these things. And we're highly social. Why is that something that people don't think about very much?
It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, you've got right to the crux of it. I think we, in a lot of my work as context, what we are saying is that we have come to a place of seeing ourselves as separate to certainly nature, separate to each other. A lot of people aren't even necessarily connected to all of themselves. And I'm genuinely not trying to sound cosmic with this. It's from a psychological perspective, how do we see identity and how do we see our place in the world? And I would say, for many of us in Western thinking, we place ourselves as separate. And so why? Well, you could rewind and go back probably to the scientific Enlightenment, when people like Galileo and Newton and Francis Bacon began to do brilliant things with maths and thinking. And a lot of very beautiful things have been written about the sense that it was in that moment that man, and I say man deliberately because it was typically men and scientists, were able to measure the world with physics and maths and work out how far we were in the universe from other stars and so on and so on. And it's an interesting moment where, as humanity, we tipped so that we began to feel like we could measure, therefore manipulate, therefore control nature. And you might say that was the seed of this contemporary way of being, which is based on, hey, I can step back from this and measure it, I can observe it, I can control it, and I can have power over it. And a lot of our education, our learning, our businesses, our governance structures, I think, still have a very deep root in that place.
And, control is really nice in a lot of ways. It's, keeps newborn babies from dying. It keeps people healthier and all these things. But you're saying it also leads to all these downstream effects, like people are super, super stressed and burning out and wondering what their purpose is and all these things.
Yeah, it's an interesting word, isn't it? Control, because I think, as you said, control, the word care for came to mind, actually. And I don't think it's either or in a way. If we go to, as you say, let's imagine if I have to go to surgery at some point in the next whenever, I would quite like the surgeon to be in control of what he's doing.
Yes.
What he's doing. Or we want to be in control when we're on our vehicles on a highway and so on. I just wonder if we're also in a moment in time when, okay, well, there's this interesting term that's come up. I understand it comes out from the US military, that we're living in a VUCA world. So VUCA is an acronym that stands for volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous. And actually in the BioLeadership work, we start in that place. We say, increasingly, we're recognizing that we're living in a VUCA world. It's very difficult to plan out what's going to happen tomorrow. In the US, you're in a world where we have an incredibly volatile and unpredictable political environment. Who knows what economically whether we can forecast anything. Here in the UK, where I am, nobody predicted that Brexit would go the way it has done. Nobody really knows what's going to happen next week, never mind in a year. So it's an incredibly volatile and uncertain world. And so how can we go about day-to-day life as if we could control any of it? And it's a bit more like surfing. We can see waves, we can see patterns, we can see changing conditions. We can't control the waves, we can't control the sea, but how do we learn how to surf it? And there's a balance, I suppose, between knowing what we can control and manage, and what do we have to ride.
That's funny. The last interview I did was with a surfer, and gosh, there's a lot of there's a lot of analogies from surfing into life.
Yeah. Right.
Are you a surfer? Do you surf in the UK?
Do you know, I don't. I mean, I would love to say I am, and I'd love to go more. I definitely belly flop on a board.
Yeah.
I'd like to do more of it, but I understand the analogy, and I think it's very useful for sure. Yeah.
And so I'm imagining that you're thinking about all this developed slowly over time. Did you grow up spending a lot of time in nature?
I was born in Bogota, in Colombia.
Okay.
So it's a pretty big, sort of smoky, bustly city. And then I spent time as a boy in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia and near Liverpool in the UK. So cities. And so it is interesting because it's not as if I had a very strong nature-based upbringing. I have very strong memories of spending time on the coast and in the mountains and being outdoors. I think for me, what led me to begin to work more and more with nature was that I've always had questions about what is the biggest picture, like what is the big picture, what is the big picture. So very early in my career, I graduated. I joined a big company. I was there for a few years, and whenever we were asked to do something as a team of people, I would say, well, how does this sit within the bigger department? And then I would ask, well, how does this department sit within the bigger company? And then how does the bigger company sit within the bigger environment or the economics of it? And it's interesting. I've always wanted to, and I've always thought about how learning happens and how different dots connect. But in asking those questions, at some point in my life, I realized, well, it all sits within nature. It all sits within this planet that is connected somehow. At the same time, one of the big shifts in my life happened maybe 9 years ago now, where I was running an agency that created play-based situations and experiences. So we would get hired to create magical environments where adults could all of a sudden step through a door and find themselves in a space where they could play.
That sounds fun.
It was a lot of fun to do, and we learned so much about the psychology of playfulness. And I was really intrigued by how many people are at work. They walk in through the office doors, and a part of them falls asleep. And only this week I was reading again these global surveys of how many people feel highly engaged at work, and it's still only sort of 13%, I think I read.
Wow.
So I was fascinated by questions of what makes us come alive, and in my mid-20s I left the world of paid employment and went off on my first adventure, and the first adventure was, okay, I'm going to create this agency that's about helping people play or just find their sense of playfulness. And we would bring artists or theatre people. We would create beautiful sets. We would sometimes work with digital artists and make these spaces where we would help people reconnect with a sense of engagement and participation. It was kind of a really interesting time.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I learned so much. It was beautiful. And then two things at the same time. One was that I myself did a master's on sustainable business, which interestingly opened up questions about, how do we really see the world? Really, what are the filters through which we see the world? Therefore, what is the frame through which we see business? What is the point of business? How does it help human systems, really? And at the same time as that, I, with the help of a friend, went and spent 24 hours by myself in a small circle out in the wild on the edge of a cliff, where I was looking down at a beautiful valley. This was in the Pyrenees in northern Spain. I was looking down at an extraordinary valley with eagles kind of circling and an incredible 360 degree horizon around me. And in that 24 hours, I realized that I made time to listen to myself in a way that I had never heard myself before. It was really fascinating. All of a sudden, I had a moment in which I could hear not just what I thought, but where those thoughts came from, and everything that I had done that was experiential, all of a sudden was in a completely different context. And I remember writing in my journal actually that when I arrived in that spot, I felt like I'd arrived in the most luxurious hotel room in the world. To me now, it sounds a bit silly even, but the feeling of arriving and feeling like I can't imagine that anybody else can be in a place as special as this at the moment. But of course, we all have access to that hotel room, even if it's kind of a back garden. So yeah, that was a bit of a ramble, sorry, but it's what led me to start to work with nature, asking questions about, well, what's the bigger picture? What do we belong to? And then having this experience where by being out in nature, I found space to actually really look inside myself in a way that I'd never done before.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the experience? Like, did you take anything with you? Were you eating? Why 24 hours?
Yeah, I can say that was the seed of what we do. The second project, which I'm involved with, which is called Way of Nature here in the UK. To give it a bit of a framing, what we do is run contemporary forms of what historically and in certain traditional cultures you would call a vision quest. Respectfully, we sometimes call it just a nature quest because we do it in a very gentle way fit for contemporary life. But the principle of it really is to leave modern life behind, in the busyness and devices and noise and preoccupation. So you would take a little while to prepare for it beforehand and maybe share a few stories of what's happening in life. And we support people with different meditation practices, different awareness practices, so different ways of opening up the senses, different ways of coming to a place of deeper stillness and a capacity to listen and observe. And then one would leave to go out and find a place in nature where we would mark a circle. You create that circle and you step into that circle and be alone, again, without any books or distractions or leaving. There's a nice expression of, the less you take, the more awaits. And that's the practice of being alone for, initially, we invite people to do 24 hours and slowly you might build up to a 4-day process. Traditional native vision quests would be a 4-day process, or a 4-day, for shorthand, you might call it a solo. And then as part of my training, I've gone out and spent longer. I once spent a month alone in the mountains in Colorado. Which was obviously one of the most unforgettable experiences of my life and very, very valuable to myself and to how I help other people kind of experience these things. So that's the essence of it. But I should say, it's important to say that the process or the experience doesn't end, or it's not just about that time alone, because at the tail end of it, what you would do is return back to base or to your community. You'd been alone for anything from that day to 4 days or even more, and then you make a bit of room to be in a circle with others, maybe around a fire or sort of in a place that feels where you can listen to each other well. And then other people invite you to share the story of what you learned, what you saw, what feels important or supportive for you, so that they can support you in bringing that story back into the world. And even then, traditionally, in some traditions, that group of people would say, effectively, thank you for bringing this story back to us. Now this is how we can use it in our lives. So our nature quest, or for me, what's very important is to help people go out, make room for themselves, use that room as a way to coming back to some of the expressions we used before, reconnect with themselves, reconnect with the essence of how nature works all around them, and to bring that goodness and that medicine back home for themselves, but to help other people with it as well.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Native American tradition doing vision quests, and I think oftentimes there is perhaps drugs, psychedelics, or other tobacco and things involved, and then also maybe like a water fast where you're, or maybe like a total fast where you're not consuming anything while you're out there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the hardest thing to think about for me is being still, like staying inside of a circle, actually, because I would get really antsy. Mm. How do they feel beforehand? Like, what are they? I assume there's like a lot of maybe curiosity and also fear and uncertainty. Like, what am I about to do? Perhaps you could sort of say, like, what happens sort of generally.
Yeah, you've got me thinking about a few things. For me, it's interesting, actually. We bring a lot of Eastern tradition into the way we do it. And my main teacher and mentor in this space is actually in the US. He's called John P. Milton. And John is now 80, and he dedicated a lifetime really to what you'd call spiritual practice, but in nature. So, and for me, I have to say, for a long time I struggled with the term spiritual, and I still don't really use it. But I take it in a pragmatic way, a sense of being part of something bigger. So I'm mentioning John because John spent a lot of time not just looking at or exploring indigenous North American traditions, but Taoist traditions, Buddhist tradition, Tantric tradition, and he went very deeply into those Eastern mindsets or philosophies, and that's one of the things that I take very much from John's work. This notion that I think in the West we spend very little time developing what is called the yin, so the capacity to let go or to release or to make space for something new to emerge. Certainly as a boy, I was never taught how to slow down, and all of my development, and the more I work with leaders and educators and schools and businesses, whatever it is, 99% of us really have spent a life where we're doing more or doing it quicker or doing it better. It's always about a yang form of progress, do more, do it quicker, and so on and so on. So it's interesting, actually, that some of the skill in stepping into these nature quest processes is in rekindling our capacity to make room, to slow down, to stop, to notice. And I've definitely seen that when we do that, a whole different quality of reflection and connection and sense of purpose comes through in our lives. I learned a long time ago, actually, that I don't have to be a doctor or an engineer or a teacher, but when I take someone from their profession through our process, it supports their thinking in a different way, and their sense of being, actually, in a different way. So it's an exercise, I think, in making space in order for something different to come through.
Was there ever a time when you thought, I want to do this work, but I don't really know how, or am I allowed to? Or did you ever have any conflict around actually doing this stuff, given that we have such a predisposition for yang and moving fast?
I think the conflict is more whether I have it's more about doing it with integrity and with care, and with quality. It's interesting you mentioned sort of, for example, medicine or plant medicine, and jokingly, sometimes it feels to me like we're in a culture where people might go off and do a month course and then all of a sudden call themselves a shaman.
Yes.
Tongue in cheek with that. So right now for me with this, the most important thing is to do it with integrity and honesty and as much authenticity as I can. And actually for me, a lot of that is about being honest about that. I was a boy born in Bogota, not in the forest, and I spent my teenage years in a northern British town that was about music and raves and things like this. And I've actually spent a good 10 years or more of my life asking very big questions and learning from very big, very special teachers about what is it to be human and how do we reconnect with many parts of being human. So for me, it's more so I think you were asking more around whether, hey, there's a struggle for others to step into something that's not about doing things quicker or faster or, more effectively or more efficiently, sorry, but it's about a whole different set of qualities that are about slowing down, noticing, observing, and so on and so on. Those are the tensions that I see. What I'm noticing now is that more and more people actually see them as valid, and more people are starting to realize that the dominant way of being in the world, the dominant mode of work, or the dominant measures of progress, they just don't feel right to a lot of people. And it's different to the traditional entrepreneurial narrative. It's different to the traditional, let's say the last 100 years narrative of doing good or being successful, but more and more people are starting to challenge that.
So when it comes time for a corporation or an individual to hire you, how do you, maybe they're curious, but they're still immersed in this 100-year-old tradition. How do you bridge where you're coming from and what you're going to teach with their thinking, so that they'll participate?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is an exciting moment for us with the BioLeadership work, actually. And effectively, you can see why, for me, the way of nature processes, which are about these deep nature quests, are like a very deep well, where anybody who's up for it and ready for it and sees value in it can come and do a nature quest with us. And it's really beautiful to be able to say we do something which is genuinely very nourishing and useful for people. And I'm a terrible marketer with it. But I like that. I'm kind of like, look, I'm not going to try and sell it. It's just, this is what you get. It's really good. And it's this very deep well, and it's nourishing in different ways for people. I do think we're also in this moment where we're saying, okay, how can we bridge some of these important skills or perspectives or values into our bigger systems, whether it's a business or a school or a government and so on. So the BioLeadership work is about bridging some of this into the world. And I can say very practically with the BioLeadership work. Well, let me say one thing first. So far, because the BioLeadership project is a couple of years old, what's happened is that it's developed organically from inspired leaders or groups who know that we need to do things differently, who don't need persuading. They're already on the same page and are committed and sort of courageously saying, right, let's do this because it's time to do it. So, for example, I'm working with Patagonia here in Europe at the moment, and they said, in terms of our leadership development, we just don't want the traditional corporate way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even want anything that's based on key performance indicators. We need something different. And I'm working with them here in Europe. We can't really say too much about it yet because it's in the beginning stages. But effectively, we're developing an approach to leadership development that is about how nature would do things. And it's about helping Patagonia grow, but also helping to transform systems. But as you can imagine, with someone like Patagonia, we were already speaking the same language.
Yeah.
There are other people here, for example, like there's somebody who's very influential in the financial services here, and I work one-to-one with him, and he's doing incredible things to try to shift responsible finance in Europe and actually globally, supporting UN and sustainable development goals type stuff. And we work one-to-one where I help him think about the principles of nature, the principles of letting go, of making space, the principles of interconnection. These are all big words, but actually it's just how life works. It's how nature works. And even if explicitly he doesn't bring it into his work day to day, it's in the background. I know that it's helpful for him. So it's happening. I think brilliant people all around the world, not just working with some of the stuff that we're doing here, but I really see these stories and these kinds of individuals and groups pop up around the world. It's brilliant. But to make it a bit more practical, with the BioLeadership work, we're saying that there are 3 threads that are important in helping this happen. And if I just say them quickly, the first thread is about developing tools and models and stories that help us translate how nature works and how healthy systems work into human structures and systems.
Okay.
So these are mental frames and models, and hey, it's what traditionally a lot of consultancies have done before. We've got a really neat way of seeing the world, and using this model, we can help a new kind of human development take place. Great, it's important and it's needed. But that's just a third of what I think is important with BioLeadership. The second thread of BioLeadership work is actually about living it and feeling it individually and internally. So if we're trying to cultivate resilience, awareness, connection, care, adaptability in the world, if these are the things that we think are important in navigating this VUCA world, which is complex and ambiguous and uncertain and so on, then I don't believe we can write about these things in textbooks and then say we know them. It's a whole different kind of knowledge. And so the second part of leadership, or BioLeadership, is about doing more to experience and cultivate those qualities internally. And as you can imagine, a lot of that for me comes from the way of nature work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And we feel it, and we feel it in each other when we know it, when we integrate it. And then the third part of BioLeadership is basically is about saying, we might have this first part cracked, which is that we know really cool models and tools that are helping our businesses or systems. We're doing the work internally, but the reality is that a lot of this is still going against the dominant way of doing things in the world.
Yes.
So actually, how do we work as a field? How do we work collectively to weave this new way of doing things into the world? How do we, and then the language that I use gets a little bit sort of learning or systems thinking-y, but how do we create a new system, and how do we kind of bring it in as another layer into the world when actually the rest of the world is still swimming in a different direction? So I'm aware I just spoke about a lot of things, but that's how I think we are trying to bridge some of this stuff and make it a bit more accessible.
Do you have some examples or bright spots of people that you've worked with that you could sort of share what's working really well, or just a case study that you like?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why it's a natural question, isn't it? Like, what does it really look like in practice? And what we've done to help that is we have a thing called the BioLeadership Map. And the BioLeadership Map, as a map does, it's about navigating a territory. So we're saying, okay, right, we're trying to get somewhere here. What do we use as a guide? And so this is what the map does. It's not a visual tool yet, but lots of people have said to me we should put it into something. But there are 5 areas of this map. So there are 5 kinds of story that we see are happening in the world that would help us bring about the kinds of new human venture that we're talking about. So the first part of the map says we can redefine purpose and progress inspired by nature. If our dominant form of purpose and progress is about continuous growth, but we now know that there are limited resources in the world and that form of growth is being destructive, then how do we change the story of growth? And there are lots of stories, like, I've mentioned Patagonia, but just the fact that Patagonia's mission statement or their legal purpose is to care for people and planet, that changes the story already. But there are other things. There's a brilliant music festival here in the UK called Shambhala, and Shambhala work with something called the Children's Fire, and the Children's Fire is taken from native cultures where the fire represents 7 generations ahead. I'm sure you know this, Derek, and so any decisions that the council around the fire make will always make sure that it's not to the detriment of those 7 generations ahead. Really beautiful. And so all of these stories at a level of purpose and progress are about saying, how do we change our story of growth? The second part of the map is about new organizational structures, again, inspired by nature. So if the narrative that we have worked with for a long time now is organizations that are based on command and control and hierarchy and structure, then yep. What are the new forms that are emerging that seem to work more like nature? And we're gathering many stories that represent just new ways of working in more adaptive systems.
This episode is brought to you by Publishizer, a crowdfunding literary agency that helps speakers, thought leaders, and authors get their books discovered by traditional publishers. A couple previous guests from this show, Colleen Schell, Melissa Lynn Stengel, and myself, have launched campaigns with Publishizer. And that's how I was able to get a publishing deal for superconductors, because we ran a successful campaign on Publishizer. The best part is that it's totally free, and you can go and their team will help you on this step-by-step process to write your 1,000-word book proposal, and they'll match you with a publisher that fits your topic. So if you want to do that, all you need to do is go to get.publishizer.com/pitch and put in the code adventure. That's get.publishizer.com/pitch, and your special code is adventure. I'm thinking right now of like ants and termite colonies, how they're different types of organizational structures. Is that the type of thing that you're talking about?
Very much like that. You can say that. Although I think yes, because that's useful in terms of saying, so therefore, how would we work? I think another nice example is, do you know the story about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone?
Yeah, I used to work in Yellowstone, funny enough.
Well, you know the story better than me. You're going to tell me I've got it wrong now. But my understanding is that by reintroducing wolves, unexpectedly, to many people, all of a sudden biodiversity dramatically and beautifully increased in different ways. And I use that as an example of, I mean, I'm mindful of time, so I won't share the whole story, but by reintroducing wolves, the deer moved to different parts of the park, and that meant that more plants and trees grew in certain places, which brought more animals in, and so on and so on. And I use it as an example to say, hey, conventionally, imagine that the brief was, could we try to develop more, could we try and change the rivers? Because that's ultimately what happened at Yellowstone. With our conventional forms of structures and thinking, who would say, well, just bring in the wolves? So all of this space about different forms of organization are about saying, a healthy natural system works in a very different way. And there are good things happening. Like, for example, I don't know if he's been on any of your podcasts, but Frederic Laloux, someone who's done a lot of work around what he calls reinventing organizations. And he's basically telling a story of how organizations are evolving, and what he calls the teal organization is about evolutionary purpose, self-management, and wholeness. That we're in a moment of time where we're trying to create these new forms of organizations that are different to hierarchical and linear. And there are great stories there. And I know we're going to be short of time, but I'll say it quickly, that the three other parts of the map are how do we work as ecologies that are operate as living interconnected systems rather than independent competitive parts of a machine. And I don't want to sound naive with the word competitive, because nature is incredibly competitive and very, very violent. However, a healthy system is competitive in such a way that it keeps the whole of the system healthy. Whereas human systems compete in a way that actually are to the detriment of the whole system. Or, we basically, it's winner takes all. Whereas I think in nature, everything is winning and losing all of the time. And the bigger picture is the winner. Derek, I know I'm saying a lot of stuff.
No, this is great. As you're talking, I'm thinking of the jungle and how packed full of things going on, and the competitive, the plants competing, and the insects and the predators and prey and everything. But the Amazon jungle is the most species rich place, and it's all, and it's just chock full of life. And so it's, on an individual basis, there's a lot of competition, but as a unit, it's working really well.
Yeah, exactly. And so we get into a characteristic of a healthy natural system is that it works through a principle of optimization. And optimization means that in my language, that the different parts hold each other to a healthy shape and balance. But human systems operate through a principle of maximization. That is, trying to grow and grow and grow and grow beyond limits. And whenever that happens in a healthy natural system, then the system will often collapse completely. We're getting into spaces where I'm sure a lot of scientists will have huge conversations about that. But I also think a lot of us feel that as you just described, that in the rainforest or any ecology really, there is a constant movement, but that helps the ecology stay relatively healthy over long periods of time. Thousands of years, I'm saying. And what we're doing is we're working with this crazy form of maximization, which effectively in less than 2 centuries is eroding and destroying a lot of the systems that we rely on. It's very sad.
It sounds like one of the things here is the short-term versus long-term thinking, and this 7 generations down the road versus quarterly profits. Those timescales are pretty different in terms of human timescales. I was just thinking about that how would I wasn't going 7 generations. I think I was just going, to my grandchildren, but like, what would I be doing in my life that's going to affect them? And, I was thinking how my ancestors immigrated to North America from Europe 10 generations ago or something like that. That's probably one of the biggest downstream effects that they did, that decision. There's certain other things that are more minor, but so it got me thinking a lot more about the location where I choose to have my home base.
These perspectives are interesting, aren't they? I mean, the world has changed so much since our grandparents decided to make these movements. There's a fantastic initiative called the Great Acceleration Project, which charts the change of speed and rates of change in, first of all, in many socioeconomic factors. So GDP, but the construction of dams, fishing, telecommunications messages, and then parallel to that, they measure rates of change in our planetary systems. And what's intriguing is that there's a point very soon after 1950 where everything changes speed to go quicker exponentially. It's not just a straight line; it just gets faster and faster and faster, and we're still on that wave.
Yeah.
And of course, when you map that against the impact on our global systems, it's not just carbon that's creating, it's not just the impact on carbon and global climate change. It's so many other Earth systems, chemical systems, aspects of diversity, influences on chemicals like nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, that affect every part of our life, and we don't. Those headlines are nowhere near any page of newspapers. We're talking about climate. We're talking about plastic a lot at the moment, but it's when we look at the story of the last 60 years and this great acceleration, it's incomprehensible. I think we can't rationalize it. We can't imagine it in our heads. And we started just before we started the call. You spoke about that moment where humanity saw Earth for the first time from outside, where we were able to see a picture of the Earth from outer space. And what an amazing moment. That was the first time where we could actually see our home and our place in the universe. And at the same time, we were kind of putting our foot down on the pedal to go even faster, to be even more damaging to our home.
One thing that I think a lot about is the accelerating rate of computational power and AI, and how that's driving a lot of changes in how we live and interact. And I get that feeling that it's moving too fast really for anyone to comprehend, because throughout humanity's history, we've been able to sort of generation to generation adapt with our world at the same pace that the world is changing around us. And now the world is changing around us faster than that we can fully comprehend. So it seems that there's a little bit of, I think that yin that you're talking about, the letting things happen and control, there's a lot of different aspects to this, but if we try to control it, it's beyond our control essentially. And it can be really discombobulating for people, because everything is moving so fast.
Yeah, I would. That resonates for me a lot. You just made me think of. There's a book called The Master and the Emissary, written by somebody called Ian McGilchrist in Scotland, and I think it's for me personally, it feels like one of the most important books of the last 10 years or so. And he describes the difference between the two hemispheres in our brain. And he says it's an oversimplification to say that the right is about creative thinking and the left is about analytical thought, because both hemispheres are always active in everything that we do. But the right hemisphere is more interested, that's not the right expression, but the right hemisphere is more about open sensing and awareness and connection, but almost in a chaotic way. There is no definition. So it's about seeing the whole or perceiving the whole, better way of explaining it. The left hemisphere is the thing that gives us boundaries and labels, and it defines things within that wild open whole. So in anything with this conversation, in painting a picture, in building a business, the right hemisphere is trying to connect with the bigger picture. The left hemisphere is the thing that helps us see and manipulate and control. And it's interesting actually, because McGilchrist would say that over the last couple of centuries, coming back to the scientific revolution, the left hemisphere has taken over the right. It's called the master and the emissary because it comes from a Chinese story about how an emperor's empire got so big that he had to send out his emissary, his kind of like counselor, to go and look after other parts of the empire. But that emissary was so clever that ultimately it took control of the empire itself. And McGilchrist says our left hemisphere is like the emissary. It's very, very clever, but it becomes our way of perceiving and controlling the world, maybe even ourselves. It's kind of quite a wild story to share.
Interesting. I want to check that book out for sure.
It's good. It's worth doing. Yeah, but there's so much to say about what you just described, but it comes back to that thing of if life, if work, if business, if community, if love is like the ocean and waves, how on earth can we control it? We have to find ways of flowing and surfing and connecting it in different ways. We can't control it. Can I say, because I'm not sure how long we've got, but just the other parts of the BioLeadership Map.
Yes,
I'll say
please.
it very quickly.
Yeah.
One is linked to what we're talking about, which is that we are seeing new stories emerge that are rooted in cultures of connection. So sometimes businesses, sometimes communities, sometimes schools. But all of a sudden, we're starting to see a different generation of human and social systems that start off from a place of, hey, you know what? We're actually part of nature. So let us develop our products, our processes, our cultures from that place of connection. It's re-enchanting. Is building not from a place of separateness, but part of. And interestingly, the last part of the map is about saying we're now starting to develop processes, products, business propositions, social systems that are regenerative rather than extractive and destructive. So throughout our lifetimes, for a long time before that, again, probably 2 centuries, we've taken more than we have given back. And we're starting to see and legitimize systems that are about replenishing rather than just taking. And then those are the 5 parts of the map that I think say, hey, that's how nature stays well, and we can borrow, and we're starting to see more stories where we learn from that intelligence and that wisdom to do things differently for ourselves.
Yeah, this is such good stuff, and I definitely want to have you back because I feel like we're just scratching the surface. But this has been super helpful to understand just how you think about all this stuff, because I think a lot of people listening and myself will, the gears start turning like, oh, okay, now what does that mean for me and my life and my business and how I'm part of this biosphere and all these things. Maybe to close today, you could suggest, if someone's listening, what, besides reading that book you just shared or going outside and more, like what are some of the ways that people could continue to explore the topics that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, what a nice question. Well, I mean, I have to say, if you're still listening, thank you for holding on for an hour. What do I think? When I first started to take people into nature, we used to try and think really hard about how to do it so that the group got a lot out of it. And then I learned something, which was that we used to say, trust the valley, trust the valley. Let's not overthink this. So if you've got a problem, if you've got if you need a different way of thinking about something, actually just play around with going out somewhere. It doesn't have to be far. It can be a park bench or, the root of a tree, and see what happens when you create a practice for yourself of going back there, maybe once a day, once a week, once a month, and really giving yourself time to let go and just notice. And sometimes that might feel challenging, sometimes it might feel hard, but over time, and sometimes very quickly, new ways of thinking come up. I mean, I think that might
That's
be
good.
the thing to leave with. Yeah, we might not need more than that.
Yeah, wonderful. Andres, thank you so much. It's been so cool just to hear you talk, and it's very refreshing. It's like, I don't know, it's like talking to you is like a walk in the woods. So really, really wonderful. Where can people find out more about you and your work and connect with you?
Thanks, Derek. That's a very nice thing to say in here, by the way. So I really appreciate that. It's bio-leadership.org, where you can find out more about the BioLeadership work, and wayofnature.co.uk. They're the two sites, and they're probably the best places to head to initially. Yeah, but thank you so much for inviting me to speak as well, Derek. It's been really good.
Wonderful. I'll talk to you soon, Andres.
Yeah, thank you. Cheers.
Man, really great episode. I hope I get to have him on the show again. I hope I get to meet him in person, honestly. And one of the concepts that really stuck with me is are you thinking 7 generations ahead? What am I doing right now that's really going to have that long of a downstream impact? And it's totally different way of thinking than by quarters, which is so much of business today. So I'd love to hear from you what insights you got from this episode. How did it change your thinking? Because it definitely is very subtle, but some big shifts in thinking, I think, come from listening to Andres and doing the things that he talked about. I've made it more of a practice for myself to make sure that I'm getting outside, getting my skin, my feet, my bare feet, whatever, on the earth, spending time in the forest as much as possible, getting sunlight on my skin, just like keep reminding myself that I'm a biological entity and that I'm not disconnected from nature, but I am part of nature. It's been really, really powerful. And if you want to check out my next book, Experience the Revolution, I mentioned that some of the inspiration from this interview from Andres is going towards that book. You can check out the synopsis. The campaign is going right now through the end of March on Publishizer. So go to publishizer.com/experience the revolution. I believe there's dashes, experience the revolution. Anyway, yeah. And if you love what the book is about, would love for you to pre-order your copy so that we can help make this a global movement. And of course, this book project ties in with what Andres is talking about and what we're all trying to do, which is to experience belonging and engagement and in addition to joy and happiness and ease. And that's what I want for you, and that's what I want for me and my kids. So yes, let's all do this together. All right, you guys, thanks so much for listening today. Now it's your turn to go out there and be adventurous.